So, salvation. Salvation takes on several different ways of thinking about it. One is the idea of rescue. And that's kind of what we think about a lot. We're in a bad state. Jesus rescues us from our bad situation and rescues us primarily from sin and from death and from the power of the devil. This rescue idea. That's true. Another common word that we'll use when we're talking about salvation is this idea of redemption. What's redemption mean? What's it mean to redeem?
Buy back.
Yeah, buy back. And I always have visions of, as a kid, and going and redeeming our green stamps. Yeah, or redeeming a coupon. Green stamps is a happy memory of my childhood, and I realize most people have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about green stamps. But I was told there are a few places still in the world where they still do green stamps. But when I was a kid, anytime you bought anything at the grocery store, you got these strings of green stamps. And then my mom would bring them home, these wads of green stamps, and you had to lick them, and they tasted horrendous, and stick them in the books. And when you filled enough books, you could go to the green stamp store and cash them in. Oh, I remember doing that. That was pretty exciting. So you would redeem your green stamps. So redemption literally means to buy back. So you buy back. Now, the redemption idea is pretty good. The ransom price is paid by Christ, who then buys us back. And as Kolb points out, this is very true, metaphors only go so far. You have to be careful not to push them too far. And a lot of pastors get into trouble in their preaching when they take a nice metaphor and they just write it a little too long, and they get into trouble. And the redemption metaphor gets into trouble when we ask the question, who gets paid back? And this is where things get a little bit, complicated. Because, well, he's paying Satan off. No, he's not. Satan's not walking away from the deal, coming out ahead because he got the payoff. That doesn't work real well. And then the idea, well, he's paying God back. And even that has some problems because scripturally we don't have that strong message that Jesus is paying off God because God is so angry that he can't possibly do anything about his anger until he gets paid off in blood. And that doesn't really work either. But you have the idea is there is a price of justice to be paid. And Christ is paying this. He is buying us back. He is winning our redemption. And this part works, the idea of paying the price and getting us back. Who gets the ransom? Not such an important thing. Another metaphor that the Bible uses frequently is this idea of new birth. So that when we are saved, it's like being born again. And that's literally what regeneration means. The regenerate just simply means born again. The new birth. So born again. And Christians are born again. Everybody. There are elements of the Christian church who talk about, are you a Christian or a born-again Christian? And they like to make a distinction. And so you have entry-level Christian, then you got serious Christian, born-again Christian. But the fact of the matter is, if you are a Christian, you are born again. And you are regenerate. You're brought into a new way of living, into a new life. And that's what salvation is. Christ accomplishes this and brings about this new birth. And what you're born into then is you now become part of God's family. Born into his family, functioning with him, living with him. You're born there, into the family of God, and now living in the reality of that family. And that again reminds us of what I was trying to get at before, that we don't live in this kind of splendid isolation as Christians. Never do. So it's not our prerogative. You're not an individual out there, kind of doing the Lone Ranger thing as a rugged individualist. You are always part of a community. You're born into the family of God, and that means that family of God has obligations to you, and you have obligations to that family, just like you do in your family. Your parents expect stuff from you, you expect stuff from them. That's the way it works. And families have that sort of interdependence. So we're born into a community, we have responsibilities to that community, and we take them seriously. Yes?
That's where we would, could you say that postmodernism emphasizes communities, and that's kind of, is that an area that the pre-modernists didn't emphasize?
Pre-modern emphasized it like crazy.
Okay.
I mean, in the pre-modern world, community was everything. That's why you have these extended families still living together. And you got grandma and grandpa living upstairs in a separate quarters, or maybe you add it on to the house and make a new addition for the new kids or whatever. But, I mean, everybody was right there, and the ties and communities were extremely tight. So, no, this has always been a part of it. The only thing that has lost the sense of community is the modern world and our highly complex mobile world. And that's a big problem, because today in our culture, the ideal worker is one who has no ties. I can move you where I want to move you. I can expect you to work when I want you to work. I can expect you to do overtime when I want you to do overtime. You have no responsibility. So the ideal worker is the single worker who has no ties to anybody. That's what corporate America really wants. And you pay attention to this, and you listen, you hear, see how true it is. Families just kind of get in the way. They're a pain. And what's happening increasingly in our culture is family is becoming sort of expendable. It's really just kind of a nuisance. And so what you really need to do is just have some way of producing kids and getting them raised so that they're productive members of society. But do you need a family to do that? Increasingly, our culture is saying, I don't know if you do. That's why we've got daycare centers raising our kids for us, and we've got, all these situations going on where families are not so important anymore. Divorce, why? Well, because the husband and wife don't like each other. It's not convenient any longer. And do we stay together for the kids? Absolutely not. That's the worst thing possible. That's what everybody says. And that's just a lie. In fact, stay together for the kids? Fine. Good reason. It's enough. Stay. Do your thing. Because you see, the world has always known that families really matter. Family, community is where you function and where you live and where you find your identity. So our culture is really hurting us off in ways far more profound than most of us realize. Okay? All right, so these are some metaphors for salvation. We also have some nice metaphors for the atonement, or the becoming right with God. We use this word, atonement. And what does atonement mean?
Coming right with God.
Yeah, getting right with God, atoning. You heard the old acronym, or kind of pseudo thing, being at one. Yeah, that gets the idea. So instead of being at odds with God or on the outs with God, we're at one, we're atoned, things are right again. And there are different ways that the Bible talks about this, and different ways that in the church they emphasize this. Sometimes we just sort of blend them all together and don't notice the differences, but it's helpful to sort of pick it apart a little bit and think about what's going on here. One of the atonement motifs, or way of talking about this, is the Christus Victor. Christus Victor motif. And you probably guess what that means. Christus Victor, Christ the conqueror. Christ the victor. Christ the winner. So the Christus Victor motif. This one goes way back. Already in the 2nd century AD, a guy named Irenaeus, a church father, was emphasizing and talking this way. Irenaeus is kind of a cool guy because, according to tradition, Irenaeus, if I remember right, was the student of a guy named Polycarp, and Polycarp was the student of John. Okay, and so Irenaeus is like 2nd or 3rd generation from the Apostle John, and he lived in the 2nd century AD. So he goes way back, one of the earliest of the church fathers. And Irenaeus liked to emphasize this concept of Jesus entering into this battle and then emerging the conqueror, winning, victorious. And so this has a pretty strong sort of a battle motif. And then it got nuanced even to include also even a courtroom motif, where you've got the attorneys for the prosecution coming in and making their case, and then the attorney for the defense coming in and making his case and arguing it and then winning. And so you have this, the victor. Again, the emphasis is on the victory, and Christ the conqueror. You have strong connections here with Easter resurrection. So the resurrection glory, and even some of the paintings in the Middle Ages, you've seen them where you have the resurrection scene where you've got Jesus coming up out of the tomb carrying the victory banner and, proclaiming the conquering. Christ with the victory banner, and the banners go forward, and the soldiers are all, cowering in fear. That's the Christus Victor, Christ conqueror. Or you'll even get this idea, kind of the St. Michael and the dragon. You got St. Michael on the horse with the spear running it through the dragon. Go look at the carving on the outside of the library. That's what that's supposed to be, St. Michael and the dragon. And so the dragon is being done in. And yeah, okay, that's from English mythology or English folklore. yeah, there's more to it than that. You also have allusions to that from Revelation, where St. Michael slays the dragon, and St. Michael typically being understood as another reference to second person of the Trinity, Christ himself, and the dragon, of course, being Satan. So you have this victory of Christ over the dragon, over Satan. So the battlefield, the courtroom. This is pretty good. Luther liked the Christus Victor motif. He talked about it quite a bit. You know, Christ in this battle, and he emerges triumphant, and Satan is thwarted and killed, and the deed is done. That's the Christus Victor. And that gets across the idea of what Christ accomplishes for us. Another one that gets used quite a bit is the idea of Christ as victim, or sacrifice. And this one became very strong and very popular in the Middle Ages, and it was probably given its classic articulation by Anselm, and we talked about him a little bit already before. But the Christ as victim sort of idea, Christ as sacrifice. And this, instead of focusing on the Easter resurrection, tends to focus, of course, on Good Friday and what God is accomplishing there on the cross, winning our salvation. So Christ as victim has the idea of the suffering servant. And in the suffering itself, the atonement is paid through the sacrifice being given. So the suffering servant, and you have all the kind of passion stuff going on here, on all the Good Friday stuff. This has always been kind of popular, but a couple years ago when Mel Gibson's movie came out, this, hit, everybody got all fired up about this stuff again. And you even had evangelicals for the first time realizing, oh yeah, Jesus suffered, that's right. Because typically your more like Pentecostal groups sort of eat up the Christus Victor, give me the victory sort of thing, go for it, and you get that. Whereas Lutherans have often rather fond of the Christ as victim, Christ in his humiliation, offering himself and giving himself, and the sacrificial thing. This is the John 1, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And that's, of course, is part of our communion liturgy, right? The Agnus Dei, right? O Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, have mercy on us. Agnus is, of course, nothing but more than the Latin word for lamb, Dei, of God. So the Agnus Dei just means Lamb of God, which is, by the way, typical of almost all the liturgy and the fancy names we have for it. It's nothing more than Latin terms for the first couple of words in the song. But it sounds a lot cooler in Latin. Agnus Dei, Sanctus, Gloria, Pax Domini, Benedictus, Nunc Dimittis. Very cool sounding. And all it means is, Nunc Dimittis is, now let me depart. That's all it is. Let's sing the Now Let Us Depart. But it's just the Nunc Dimittis. All right. So the Christ as victim motif, the Christ as victor motif, they're not the same thing. They're different. Which one is scriptural? No, they both are. These both get at truth, and they both communicate. Christ as victor, that's clearly there. You've got Christ triumphant. You see this especially in the Apocalypse. It comes through in the Revelation very strongly. It comes through in some of the epistles as well. Christ as victim, you get that too. The sacrifice, Christ in his humiliation, pouring himself out, making himself nothing. Philippians really does both of them. So Christ empties himself, giving himself to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has exalted him and given him the name above every name, the name Kyrios, Yahweh, not the name Jesus. So at the name Yahweh, every knee will bow, because Christ is Yahweh in the flesh. So you got both of them going there. Christ is victim, Christ is victor. They're both good motifs. They both work well. There's another motif that was kind of put forward and promulgated in the Middle Ages by a guy named Abelard.